Thank you very much. My name is Cesar Burga Idrogo. I'm a third-year PhD student here at UCL, City of Education. And as you can see, this time I'm going to present a part of my research, which is focused on the understanding of earning inequalities in Peru. Basically, the idea of how inequalities operate, through which means, and what's the role played by education. Yes. So, um, so this is the content of the presentation, and yes, just to start, as you know, there's generally this idea in economics that wages are determined by marginal productivity of workers. So based in this framework, human capital theory defends that if workers invest in education, then they can rise their productivity, and by this means, they can also rise their earnings, right? And as a proxy of skills and productivity, educational attainment should be among the aspects or the factors that explain earning inequalities the most. However, there are also critics to this approach. There is literature that states that there is important inequalities in labor market outcomes and in earnings, of course, even across equally educated workers. And main sources of inequalities are associated to workers' background, right? Such as their gender or their income level, or the lack of educational resources, or even some linguistic or ethnic barriers. Thing is that as social background is theoretically, right, in principle, independent of productivity, and productivity shaped by education, then inequalities among equally educated workers can be considered as a sign of discrimination in the labor market. And yes, the idea of this presentation is basically trying to explore how these inequalities operate, and also try to give an interpretation about it, not necessarily aligned to discrimination in labor market, but as different strategies that people, that workers have, depending on their social background. So these are basically the questions that I try to address: how to understand the relationship between earning inequalities and education, to what extent education can account for social background difference, and how this can help to inform policy aiming to reduce earning inequalities. And I explored this topic for the Peruvian context. Why the Peruvian context? Well, basically, because Peru is based in Latin America, which is one of the most unequal regions in the world. Yes, it's important. It's a major topic in Latin America, understanding earning inequalities and social inequalities in general. But there's also another aspect that makes Peruvian case interesting. As you may know, Latin America, with also South Asia, if I'm not wrong, are the regions where higher education has expanded the most in the last years. So it's also important to know, in this context of expansion of higher education, especially at university level, to what extent university investments can actually, and educational investments in general, can actually account for earnings improvement and also earnings inequality. And finally, because as many other Latin American countries, Peru has a strong polarized labor market, in which there is a huge informal sector characterized by low wages. There's also a considerable proportion of underemployment, even among educated population. There's only a small formal sector, generally characterized by extractive industries and public administration. So in this context, it's important also to assess the advantage that education brings, but also the limitations that it may have. Okay, so these are the questions that I've already presented. How to understand the relationship between earning inequalities and education, to what extent education can effectively account for social background inequalities in labor market earnings, and how can we use this information to improve policy, especially policy that wants to address this topic of earning inequalities. And for this, I'm using John Life's longitudinal data from Peru. John Life's data started in 2002, and since then it has collected information from two cohorts of children in Peru, one born in 1994 and the second one born in 2000. And the advantage of this data is that it has an important range of information of different characteristics of children at different stages of their life. We can know about children's expectation about their education, parent expectation about their education. We can also know how much time of their lives they spend on studying, not only at school, but also out of school, how much time of their life they spend working. So this wide set of variables can allow us to better understand where and how inequalities start to emerge, and what's also the long-term impact of these variables in workers' earnings. Yes, so in this case, I will focus on the older cohort, which has a very small sample, unfortunately, but it's the only sample that has, I mean, the younger cohort started in 2002, and sorry, the younger cohort is for children that were born in 2000, and unfortunately for 2020, which is the last time we have data available, they're just moving to labor market, and that's why I didn't take that data set, even if the sample is greater. So I focus on the older cohort. Again, the sample is very small, but it's the only cohort that has somehow moved or complete the transition to labor market. And this is the participation rate. It was fairly high until 2016, but during COVID crisis, yes, there was a considerable attrition. So it's important to consider this. What's the variable that I'm analyzing? Well, the monthly net income, which was reported between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, so just before COVID crisis. This is a dependent variable, and well, the advantage and the limitations of this variable. The advantage is that, as I mentioned, it allows us, it's captured in a very early stage of labor market transition, 25, 27, so it allows us years old of children, so it allows us to see how earning inequalities emerge. And it's also a variable about pre-COVID situation, so theoretically, it's not affected by pandemic crisis, right? However, there are also some limitations, and well, you can see them. One of the limitations is that the variable is calculated as monthly income, so differences in the number of hours worked in a month across individual can under or overestimate the coefficients. And also the variable was collected during the most critical period of COVID. So there is a risk of bias in the information reported, right? So the information, children were asked about their earnings before the COVID, but they were asked during COVID crisis, right? So even if they were asked for a period before COVID, which theoretically is not affected by COVID shock, the answers reported can be affected by some bias after COVID shock. So that's also a limitation. The variables used to measure children's social background are three: gender, mother education, and mother tongue. And yes, the method used to explore these inequalities are Kitakawa, Blitter, and Oaxaca decomposition. The decomposition equation is there. As you can see, the variation in the Y, which is the variation in the log earnings by social background. For each one of the measures of social background. And then we have the first component of this decomposition, which is the share of that gap that can be attributed to characteristics. And the second part of that decomposition, which is the share of that gap that can be attributed to coefficients, which is generally called discrimination, but in this case, I interpret it more as a earning opportunity costs, and I will explain this more in detail when I present the outcomes. Okay, so these are the covariates that I'm including. 4 sets of covariates: motivational variables, education variables, occupational variables, and sociodemographic variables. As you can see, there are a lot of variables, and with such a small sample size, it's not possible to include all of them. So, yes, I try to include the most significant ones of each type of variables. And this is a summary of the steps I use for this research. As I said, I start by identifying the earning gaps with just a simple linear regression of earnings by each measure of social background, right? Females versus males, less educated children versus children for less educated mothers versus children from more educated mothers, and children from indigenous mother tongue and children from non-indigenous mother tongue. So this is the first step. The second step is deciding the covariates to use, and for that I use a backward stepwise regression with log earnings as dependent variable and each set of independent variables as predictors, right? So I at the end I do like 4 stepwise regressions: one for motivational variables, one for educational variables, one for occupational variables, and one for social demographic variables, and I keep at each subdimension the most important predictors. Then I conduct the separate regressions for each group, and finally I do the earning decomposition using yes, the Oaxaca and Blinder, Kirakawa, Oaxaca and Blinder decomposition, and Jan's correction for the identification problem, which is common for this method. Again, it's important to remember that there is a sample size limitation. So we have a sample of 400 and something, and 85% of the sample was working before COVID. So it's about 370 observations. This is important. It's a kind of a strong limitation. Unfortunately, this is a regular problem for global South countries. There is a lack of longitudinal data, but still, yeah, there are still some important findings that I will present. Okay, so moving to the findings. This is the first step, right? Which is the calculation of earning gaps. You can see that earning gaps are greater for the measure of social background, which is mother tongue, but it also has the biggest standard error, and this is because there is a small share of indigenous of children with an indigenous mother tongue. The second one is gender, which also has the smaller standard error, and it's well, you have the gap there, and then we have mother education, which is a considerable gap, 0.34 minus 0.34 in log of earnings, but it's not statistically significant to a 95% of confidence. Well, it's marginally significant, right? Again, this could be a matter of sample size. Yes, this is the gap that we are trying to decompose and to explain. And well, first to start with separate regressions. This one is for gender. As we can see, perhaps one of the most striking things is that more educated males have actually a wage penalty, while more educated females have wage premium, right? And although this can appear to be counterintuitive, it's actually not. Remember that people who invest in education has less working experience, and in that way, most of males in attending higher education and university are also have less experience, and then males who have moved to labor market before can have more earnings at 26, 27 years old, right? However, for females, we can see that actually there is a positive earning, a positive premium, and this indicates that the penalty of not studying for females is even worse than for males, right? The point I'm trying to make is that for a female, the early transition to labor market already reports greater wages than for males. And this is because most of females who don't study have a huge wage penalty. Most of them dedicate to street vendor activities or house caring activities and stuff. So this is how we can understand this positive premium for females, even at a very early stage of labor market transition. Just to move forward, because I'm kind of with a short time, I just want to mention here that perhaps one of the most important things is to keep from this table is the difference in coefficients, right? The structure of coefficients is different from males and females. This is going to be clearer in the next slides, but yes, I can return if you want in the question sections to show in detail how the difference of coefficients structure is, how the structure of coefficients differs from males to females in the fourth model. In the case of regression yes, difference in the structure of coefficients by educational background, it's not that huge compared to gender. As we can see, the coefficient associated to educational attainment, looking at the fourth column of each panel, it's not that huge compared to the differences in gender, right? So it's not, there's not a huge difference again in the structure of the coefficients, and then this means that there's not a huge difference in yes, in rewards in labor market. And in terms of the equations for mother tongue, we can see that there is a considerable difference in coefficients, but that this is kind of compensated, right? For instance, we have a huge difference in coefficients for the variable urban. We see that the premium for indigenous is way higher than for non-indigenous, but we have a huge penalty for the variable agriculture, right? So it means that indigenous children or workers that remain in agricultural occupations have the income that is way lower than those who are not indigenous, right? So there's a difference in coefficients, but it's more or less compensated across all the structure of coefficients. And this can be more clearly observed when we make the composition outcome, when we plot the decomposition outcomes, right? So this is the gap that we presented at the beginning. There are some variations because of some missing values in the sample, but this is the gap that we present at the beginning. And we can see that for female, for the gender gap, most of it comes from a difference in the structure of coefficients, right? In the structure of remunerations or rewards in labor market. In the case of inequalities by mother education or mother tongue, most of it comes from difference in characteristics. This means difference in educational attainment or academic achievement and so on. So to explore in detail each one of these gaps, this is the gap for gender. As we can see, the amount of inequalities coming from characteristics is very, very small, but the gaps coming from coefficients is considerably high. And we can see that the constant is way smaller for females, meaning that for less educated females, the penalty is way bigger than for less educated males. And this, again, can be understandable if we think that most of less educated females work as street vendors or carers in the house, while less educated males can work in some low-skill occupations, which are still more remunerated than these occupations. But we can see also that academic achievement is way more rewarded for females, and also tertiary education is way more rewarded for females. And this is because, again, the counterfactual of not studying for females is even worse than for males. So the earning opportunity costs of not studying for females is is even worse than for males. We saw that males at 26 years old can even make more money than those who decided to study. But females at 26, 27 years old, if they do not study, they will be more probably dedicated to these activities which are less remunerated. In the case of mothers' education inequalities, as we mentioned, they are more or less compensated, the coefficient inequalities, and most of inequalities and gaps come from difference in characteristics, lower academic achievement at early age, and also a lower representation in urban areas in which there are generally the most remunerated jobs, the best remunerated jobs. Finally, by mother tongue, again, the gap in coefficients is considerable, but it's more or less compensated. And the inequalities that are not compensated come from academic achievement and from an overrepresentation of indigenous population in agricultural occupations, which are the less remunerated, and also less representation in urban areas. And Stefan, sorry to move forward, but I think I'm almost out of time. So just to move to conclusions and some insights of policy, a considerable part of the variation in earnings by workers' mother educational background and ethnic background can be explained by educational factors, lower academic achievement at early age and less time to study. But there is also an important part coming from occupational and sociodemographic characteristics. Another important conclusion is that earning opportunity costs of not study is modest between children with different educated mothers. And while it's important for children from different mother tongue, it's more or less compensated, right? The structure of coefficients compensate these gaps. In the case of gender, inequalities is almost exclusively driven by a different structure in coefficients, which means a different premiums by educational investment and also in each occupation sector, meaning that women and men have completely different earning opportunity costs, and also that most of the inequalities come from an extreme penalty for women that are less educated, right? So less educated women have a wage penalty that is even greater than males, and in that way, yes, the gap increases. That the gap happens because if women do not study, they are more likely to be a carer or an informal worker like a street vendor and stuff. So these are the conclusions and some preliminary insights for policy. It's important to consider that in-detail findings are not conclusive. The findings presented here are not conclusive. The main limitation is the sample size, of course. But policy aiming to address this topic may try to start thinking that different social background inequalities are explained by different variables, right? And by different factors. While policy aiming to address inequalities by mother educational background or ethnic background could focus on increasing time to study out of school for children or improvement children achievement at a very early age, or increasing well-remunerated jobs in some regions beside the coasts or in agricultural sector. Policy aiming to address gender inequality should focus on equalizing the earning opportunity costs, which means that penalty for women that do not study should not be like losing any possibility of having a decent job, right? So improving quality of employment opportunities for less educated women is important. And it's also important to fight gender stereotypes, right? Even if a woman at a point decides to dedicate to street vendor activities, there should be possibilities to continue their studies, and sometimes this is not possible because there are gender stereotypes reinforcement. So it's important also to fight these stereotypes in order to facilitate women transition to study and other investments that can help improve income. So this is the end. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any question. Thank you very much.